Morning. My name is Sophie Hill. I'm here representing a large interdisciplinary group down at Brigham Young University as a postdoctoral researcher, showing some of the stuff that we've been working on having to do with improving our representations of the modern water cycle, as well as the resources that are widely available. And I'd like to take a second right up here at the very front to emphasize the fact that we are always looking for additional collaborators. And so if anybody is interested in helping either with development or providing feedback to the work that we'll discuss here, please feel free to reach out via my contact info. You can see my email here in the bottom left-hand corner, and we'd be very happy to further collaborate. And so the water cycle diagram is something that we're all very familiar with. It usually involves lots of representations of water, as well as lots of arrows showing or indicating how water that is moving across the landscape. However, there's something very notable and important that usually is missing from our water cycle diagrams. And it's mentioned here that this diagram shows the Earth's natural water cycle, omitting the significant impacts of human influences. So, lest we think that USGS is the only source of this lack of humans, a wide-scale analysis of over 450 water cycle diagrams found that this trend held true across most representations, with only 15% indicating or visualizing human interactions with water, and less than 2% showing important changes such as climate or water pollution, things that we continue to worry about in the future. And so these water cycle diagrams represented all age levels as well as international sources. And you can see as we're flipping through these very quickly that occasionally we did see humans on the landscape, such as this agricultural field here or this factory here, but no connection showing how they then we impacted water cycling, for example, through agricultural runoff in this case, or maybe something such as stormwater and several other changes as well. Which begs the question that as our global population continues to expand, how important is it for us to actually focus on this natural water cycle? If we're looking at this night lights image from NASA, it's very clear to see that human influence is pervasive across the landscape, and places where there's the least impact, such as Sahara and various other deserts, are places where there's not notable or large amounts or quantities of water. So, let's dig a little bit deeper into how humans then influence water cycling. One of the most important ways is through land use change. And so as we are developing agricultural lands, urban development, or deforestation to create the others, we're impacting where water is stored or how water is stored on a landscape, as well as how it moves. If you take a second to picture a very heavily forested area being converted to, for example, a parking lot, the water is going to move very differently across the two landscapes. And it's also going to be present or stored in very different ways, depending on how that land is then used. Another important influence is through climate change. We continue to adapt or to create issues for our global weather patterns, which changes when water is found on the landscape, in addition to how much is there, and that can have drastic impacts for water cycling. And finally, one of the more relatable ways we influence water is through withdrawals and pollution, and things like municipal water use, as well as industrial water use, and the pollutants that we occasionally contribute back to water after it has been used for our various purposes. And so these human changes can lead to disruptions of water storage, but also how it flows on many scales. So something from a local or residential area all the way up to regional, moving up to global scales. Which begs the question, do omissions in water cycle diagrams contribute to misconceptions that humans have about overabundance of water, or their lack of influence on a hydrological system? Another way to look at that might be, do water cycle diagrams that then include human influence thus improve student or population understanding of how water moves? And so this diagram, which was created as part of a collaborative work and published in Nature Geosciences in 2019, shows that we're trying to represent the water cycle while looking at it with a much more human-centric contribution. The purple areas here are indicating pollution caused by discharge or groundwater, as well as other ways which we then use water across a landscape. And while this is definitely a step in the right direction, it's not widely available and not always widely interpretable to a broad population or audience. And so we're working to further expand the resources that are available for water cycle education, and then to further vet and disseminate those resources to various populations. So an additional project was undertaken by Leslie Lang and Anna Wright here at Brigham Young University to take that a representation like the one we saw before and make it widely available by updating the Wikipedia water cycle page with this image that you see here. While we're able to then show human influence across the landscape, these are definitely steps in the right direction. We know there's lots of additional work that needs to be done. And so I'm going to show you some of the preliminary figures and drafts and representations that we're creating, as well as other additional ways that we're looking into to disseminate some of this very important information. And so through collaborations with the USGS, they're actually working to currently update the resources that they have available. This is just a very draft image, but shows you their landscape that they're creating through their water cycle representations has quite a large representation showing human influence across this landscape. But there's still more work to be done, and we don't really want to duplicate their efforts. So we are developing additional materials and have a series of guidelines that we're working through with them. First being showing water from a human perspective, the idea of looking up and out at where the water is across the landscape, rather than down from a 30,000-foot airplane view at a generic location somewhere, usually involving an ocean. Second thing we want to emphasize is a two-way interaction and moving past this narrative that humans use water, but how does water impact us and how do we impact the water around us? Highlighting invisible and virtual water sources across the landscape, so emphasizing atmospheric and groundwater, not always as visible, as well as the virtual water or indirect water usage through food, industry, and manufacturing. Also highlighting systems thinking skills. If I were to do X here, how will that impact water there? And the idea of return flows. So because we're using these representations showing these large scale landscapes, sometimes we're not able to fully capture the idea that water can go through several miniature feedback loops or just local cycles, returning the water back into the system, not always having to go all the way to the ocean before re-entering. And then that water cycling will change with time. Seasonal changes, which are important for things like snowpack and long-term water storage, but also climate change and how that long-term storage can be impacted as we continue to alter Earth's global weather patterns. And most importantly, we're trying to reach a very broad audience. I tongue-in-cheek put everyone here, but yeah, kind of. We're highlighting elementary students, as well as secondary educators, undergraduate educators in classrooms, and including the general public with the resource development. And I want to highlight some of the fantastic illustrators we have who are working on this project with us. They've been great and are highly interested in science engagement expressed through art. Feel free to reach out to any and all of them. So the first image I want to show you is just where is the water? We're looking at the water cycle from an urban landscape, which some things might look familiar. Rain in the background, infiltration of groundwater shown in the bottom right. But there are also additional places, sources of water in this landscape that might not be intuitive. Because this is a recording, feel free to pause, take a minute, look around and see if you can identify approximately 10 different sources of water on this landscape. And assuming you've paused, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what those are. We highlighted them here in blue. So notice we didn't highlight the pond. That's fairly intuitive, but there are examples of direct water use through municipal, such as this water tower here, the water we use in our home, dishwashing, drinking water, etc. Water or fire hydrant usage here. Yet some that are a little bit less direct or maybe less intuitive. So this groundwater infiltration, but also leading to runoff. water underground being taken up through trees or vegetation, leading to evapotranspiration. So these squiggly lines representing a phase change. The idea that water is then moving and being transformed into a different phase is very important. And we'll get more into evapotranspiration later, as well as indirect water found in our clothing and our food, various manufacturing processes seen over here. And how that is then, those products are then transported across a landscape. So we are moving water from where it originated to additional places, and quite often concentrating them. So there's a lot of import that happens in cities from the surrounding landscapes. And so we're really literally moving water from where it was to where it eventually will end up. And then the idea that water is found in the cells of all living organisms. So this combination of the where is the water poster with how does that water move across the landscape is accompanied with some short explanations, as well as these graphical icons highlighting how that water then moves, why it's important, and trying to move a little bit beyond simply the vocabulary terms of evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and focusing in specifically on the concept of that phase change and what implications that might have for where the water eventually will end up. And of course, we need to highlight that not all water is readily usable, and certainly not for everything that we want it for. This could be due to geographic concerns. Fresh water isn't always right next to me, but it also has to deal with some of these additional factors, such as being frozen. So glaciers and ice caps, that water is not readily available to, say, water your crops when you live in California. But also the idea of saline water. So this is obviously the ocean is the one that comes to mind. We have salt water that isn't generally used to water your crops directly, but a lot of our inland water bodies, our inland lakes, also contain high salinity, as well as much of our groundwater as well will require some sort of treatment. So the additional things such as pollution, water pollution via nutrients, as well as thermal pollution or temperature, putting hot water back into a system where this surrounding ecosystem is used to certain colder temperatures, and the idea of a non-renewable water source. So we're using water quicker than we can replenish it. And so that's the issue that we see quite often with these deep groundwater wells and aquifers being depleted. Additional work we're doing will highlight some of the different components of the water cycle. So blue being how humans move or use water and all the infrastructure accompanying those various usages. Green water highlighting evapotranspiration and that land use change as we develop agricultural crops that causes the soil moisture or the water, the liquid water that is found within our soil layer. And then through the process of evapotranspiration, as it moves up through the plants or the various drinking straws, I like to refer to them as, it is then transformed into water vapor. This is an area that doesn't get enough respect. As we are changing the vegetation on a landscape, we are changing how much water is then being stored within the soil, as well as how much water is moving up and into that atmosphere. So plants are a very important part of the water cycle in that they drive this massive amount of phase change in moving water from liquid up into the atmosphere. And also the gray water components, which is water impacted by human processes and pollution, whether this is industrial runoff, things such as mining or wastewater treatment, as well as just simply stormwater that it flows off the city containing nutrients and other pollutants into local water bodies. And we're continuing to develop these diagrams, looking for ways to express the depth as well as regional trends, such as the image in the back here showing atmospheric rivers moving across various landscapes. I should mention that all of these resources highlighted here will be available online at the website watercycle.byu.edu. This will be a clean landing page for all of the resources that we develop, as well as additional ones that we are able to locate. And it'll go live in January 2022, so January of this coming year. I'd like to switch gears and highlight an additional project we're working on called the Core Project Graphic Novel. And this is a way that we've developed to help share. We're targeting generally 6th through 8th grade, 4th 4th, 5th, 6th grade through 8th grade, and highlighting some of these vague or abstract concepts, environmental concepts such as pollution, biodiversity, the water cycle, permafrost, and climate change, but showing them in a fun way, teaching them in a fun way through use of beautiful illustration, as well as kind of quirky dialogue, as a way to help these individuals, or to help young people grasp some of these difficult concepts. And so highlighting just a few of the pages or the images that we produced, this idea of having a little geneticist is our little robot who helps them navigate some of these different systems and provides them with additional information or data as they're moving through. And they also encounter several specialists or counselors who serve as experts in the various locations and are able to teach a little bit more about the landscape, as well as some of these difficult but very critical issues that are highly impacted by humans. And so again, these individuals come from very different landscapes, different places on Earth, as well as different family situations, but highlighting that diversity and bringing it together to address these global these issues that are of global concern to the human population is something that we're really working hard to do. And so I'll just give you, we're not done with all of our chapters, including the water cycle one yet, but I'd like to just highlight some of the ways that we've addressed this through the chapter we have completed thus far on permafrost. So most humans do not interact with a permafrost zone. It's not something we can draw a personal experience on. And so it's not something that we generally relate to. We know it happens. We know where in the north generally is where we'd think of, but it's not something that these students are necessarily able to grasp easily. And so through the use of illustration, as well as clever analogies, such as our freezer here, talking about when you unplug it, what happens, food rots, that releases smells, and those smells are representative of different gases that are being released. We're able to take this idea of an abstract permafrost happening thousands of miles away and bring it to something that these students relate to on a regular basis. And the idea, of course, is that the global importance of these issues, so permafrost holding almost 3 times as much carbon as all living things on Earth, that really puts into perspective that this one ecosystem contains a lot more than we give it credit for. And there is additional beautiful imagery that our illustrators have created to capture some of that. So with that, there are many thanks to be given for all my different collaborators, the illustrators who have worked on this project, and the support provided through Brigham Young University's Interdisciplinary Research Grant. Again, if you're at all interested in helping to contribute or keep up or follow some of the work that we're doing, you can reach out to me at sophie_hill@byu.edu, and I'm happy to be sharing some of this additional information. And look for that website, watercycle.byu.edu, to go live in January, and what will be continually updated as we continue to work through this project. Thank you.